How we, you doing good? Good. All right. I'm just going to jump in today because we got places we need to go, right? In the Word. I know you're already looking to lunch, so just hang on to that. And thank you so much for the biscuits and gravy and the cinnamon rolls and pancakes. And yeah, so we didn't suffer at all. If it's true, if it really happened, if God can do that, then that means an awful lot to us, doesn't it? If it really happened, then that means that the resurrection is true. And I realize that that's a pretty big if for some people. But if it's true, then it ought to mean something to the rest of us. I'm guessing everybody that's here could be here for a little bit different reason. Maybe a friend invited you. Maybe you lost a bet. And so, dragged me along. Some of you just love biscuits and gravy. That was incredible to see you here before the biscuits and gravy got here this morning. So thank you for that. But whatever the reason, it's my hope that you can find something meaningful out of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to consider some things together that I think have meaning for all of us. And in case we haven't met yet, my name is David, and they allow me to be the lead pastor here. Allow that. What we're going to do right now is we're going to move into this whole discussion of the resurrection. And our question is, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? So let me start by asking a very personal question. How many of you consider yourselves to be fairly logical? Okay, all right. How many of you were pretty shocked that the person next to you raised their hand? Well, for those of us who are fairly logical, and maybe, I don't know, you studied logic in a math course or maybe in a philosophy course in college or in high school. I'm sure somebody out there did, and you can tell me what a conditional is. Can you tell me what a conditional is? Do you remember that from logic class? Now, I know that all of you know this, but you're not answering because of the person sitting next to you, because you don't want to look like you know everything, right? So for the sake of the person sitting next to you, let's put a definition up on the screen. In symbolic logic, implication is present for if-then propositions, which serve some causal, logical, definitional, or material relationship. Impressed? I'm not. It's like, oh, okay, what is that? Yeah, can you make sense of it? Well, let's break it down, because it's all right there. You just have to strip away a lot of the words. A conditional is an if-then statement. Yeah, I had a couple over here that knew that. It's an if-then statement, and you know what I'm talking about. If this happens, then this is going to happen as well. And we deal with these all the time, don't we? Let me try a couple out on you, and you can help me by filling in the blank here. If you eat a pound of chocolate on Sunday, then, yeah, I'm hearing a lot of the same kinds of answers that are coming about where you would be on Monday and what would happen to you. Let's try one more. If you keep spending more money than you actually have, then, yeah. We all know what's going to happen with some of those things, don't we? So we all know what an if-then statement is. And what I want to do is I want to start looking through this entire resurrection discussion. I want to look at the conditional statements, because I think some of us get stuck on either end. If it happened, some of us are stuck there because we're not really sure that it actually did happen. The other side is the then. Then what? What does that mean? I don't know that. Yeah, I believe it, but I don't really know what it means to me. And I think as we go through these discussions, you're going to come to a point of maybe understanding it in a way that you haven't understood it before. But I'm going to ask you to kind of think right now about which side of that you lean on. You know, I'm kind of leaning on the if side. I don't really know that I believe this. I've heard about the resurrection. I've heard about the crucifixion, but I'm not really sure that it all happened. Or if you're stuck on the then side, yes, I believe it. but I'm not really sure what it means to me today. Where are you on this? So we're going to start with the if side of the equation, and it's okay to ask questions about this. We do that a lot around here. If there's something you don't understand, then we will try to help you understand that when we get a chance to sit down and talk about that. But I think God is big enough to handle any of the doubts that we may have, so we don't shy away from those kinds of questions. But again, some of you may be going, seriously, Pastor, are you telling me that you believe that Jesus was literally resurrected from the dead? Yeah, do you really believe that? And my answer would be, yes, I do. I really do. Now, before some of the others of you check out on me, let's look at some of the evidence that is there, okay? I'm just going to kind of walk you through this, and you can either jot this stuff down or you can go back and watch this again later. But I'm going to go through it quickly. But let me start off saying that Jesus was killed by people who knew how to kill people, okay? So the first thing that you notice in chapter 19, verse 18, it says they crucified him. They did. The Romans were very good at this. In fact, the centurion who was in charge of the crucifixion would have been punished by death himself if he had botched the crucifixion. They took this stuff that seriously. So think about this. After Jesus had carried the crossbeam outside the city walls of Jerusalem, when they got to a place called Golgotha, he is nailed to the cross. He is attached by his wrists and his feet. He's tied up that way, and that's where Jesus died. And at the end of this nightmare scene, a Roman soldier takes a spear and puts it right below the rib cage, straight to the heart. He punctures the heart and the water sac around the heart, proving that Jesus really was dead. Now, if you read through the story, it's about this time that the Roman governor Pontius Pilate gives a couple of Jewish council members permission to take the corpse. And that doesn't come through when we're reading our Bibles, but in Mark 15, verse 45, the word body that's in your Bible, the word body is literally dead body. The corpse, they had permission to take that. So it was at that point that a group of men and women are going to wrap the body of Jesus in spices and strips of linen. It's all going to weigh about 100 pounds. And they tuck him into a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea. And here's something you need to understand. Everybody knew this. Everybody knew where the tomb was. Everybody knew that Jesus was dead. There were no questions about it. We read that they rolled a huge stone over the opening of this tomb, and there's a seal applied to it, which would have involved wax and rope. And what that meant was that if anybody broke that seal, they could be punishable by death as well. The Romans were big on execution. So that meant everybody knew where the tomb was, and nobody wanted to mess with it. See, the problem is, here's the next bit of evidence that we need to think about. And that's, secondly, in John 20, verse 1, it tells us that by Sunday morning, the tomb was empty. By Sunday morning, he's put on the cross, he's in the tomb. By Friday, on Sunday morning, the tomb is empty. It's recorded right there in John 20, verse 1. If you struggle with this, you need to know that even those who are not friends of Christianity, they're going to just tell you flat out, it was an empty tomb. There's nothing that they can do about that. There's no way that the story of the resurrection can catch traction in a city where it actually happened, where Jesus was executed and buried. There's no way this story gets any traction at all if the tomb was not empty. Thousands of people respond in faith in the coming weeks because the disciples are going around telling everybody, Jesus is risen. Jesus is alive. The authorities would have loved nothing better than to be able to produce a body, than to be able to produce the tomb where the body still was, but they couldn't. They had no body, and the tomb was empty. Now, it gets worse for the authorities. They thought they had heard the last of Jesus, but another piece of evidence here are the eyewitnesses, because they say that they've seen him alive. And it's not just one person who's seen him alive. We have not just 10 or 12 people, but the Apostle Paul writes about this in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 5 through 8, the Apostle Paul gives us a list of eyewitnesses who saw Jesus alive. It's kind of like he's issuing a challenge. He's saying, seriously, there were like 500 some people in and around Jerusalem. Most of them are still alive. Go talk to them. Interview one of them and see if the stories line up. And the Apostle Paul says this thing was not done in a corner. It wasn't done in hiding. And this miracle didn't stay in a corner, because now this story begins to go all the way throughout the Roman Empire. And it is led by, of all people, these disciples, who very early in the Gospels really don't come off very well. You know what I mean? Their stories just weren't all that great. These were the guys who buried their heads in shame at the first sign of trouble. They were constantly tucking their tunics into their belts and running away. But these are the guys who are now going to lead the charge. And do you remember where Jesus finds them after the resurrection? When he meets up with them to talk to them, Jesus finds them behind a locked door. They're wondering if they're next. But in a matter of days, they go from cowering behind locked doors to leading a revolution. I think it bears the question, how does something like that happen? Well, history tells us that all but one of these disciples is executed in the coming years for this very reason, for confessing that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Not one of them backed down. They're persecuted, they're tortured, they're beaten, they're imprisoned. And like I said, all but one of them is actually martyred for their faith, for professing that the resurrection actually happened. And just trust me, none of them on the way to the gallows, none of them on the way to the sword, none of them on the way to their own death said, whoa, time out, I'll tell you where the body is. All I want from this is a book deal. I'm not dying for this, okay? Not one of them did that. Now think about this logically. People die for causes, okay? We see that in our world. People die for causes all the time. But nobody dies knowingly for a hoax. Something flipped these guys almost immediately from being scaredy cats to being heroes. It was like, boom, it just happened and they're there. What happened to them? Well, there's all sorts of evidence that we can look at. There's the eyewitness accounts. There's the change in the disciples. There's the empty tomb. There's the fact that people saw him. There's the fact that he really died. There are a lot of things that we can look at. What am I trying to say to you? I'm trying to say to you that the Christian faith is not intellectually sloppy. I'm saying that you should now, if this is a new thing to you, you should now pursue this. You have enough evidence from what we've talked about this morning for you to pursue some of your questions. And I'll say it again, it's okay here at the Crosswalk to be a skeptic. Just do something with it. Don't just hang on to it, okay? Don't fold your arms and go, no way. Don't need any more of that, okay? There's at least enough evidence for you to get started seeking this thing out. Years ago, I used to be a youth pastor. You'd never figure that out, would you? This was, I don't know, almost 40 some years ago. That's pretty good since I'm only 42. You like that? I used to take high school kids to the Great Smoky Mountains, and we would hike for a week along the Appalachian Trail, and we would live out of our backpacks, which was a grand experiment for teenagers. We even had kids who brought their hair dryers thinking that they, I don't know if they thought they were going to plug them into a tree, or something like that. But the kids were always excited, though, because the stories would go from year to year, and we always saw animals, and we had experiences with wildlife. And so every year, at the beginning of this, we would go over the same set of rules. And they're simple things, like make sure you dispose of your food properly. Otherwise, the animals will come for it. And when you climb in your tent at night, make sure that you zip up the flap, or you might have some unwanted visitors coming to join you. So on the first night of this particular trip, we were actually in a campground at the base of the Smoky Mountains. And that night, one of our groups of boys decided they were going to pop some popcorn over the fire, which is great, no problem. Except instead of getting rid of the kernels in the trash, they simply threw them out beside their tent. Smells good, doesn't it? When they headed to bed, they got into their tent, but they never bothered to zip it up. And then they proceeded to sleep, not with their heads all the way in the back of the tent, but with their heads out to the front of the tent where there was fresh air. In about 2 hours, we started hearing some very excited whispering going on in that area. It seems a couple of skunks had found the popcorn, and then they proceeded to the open tent where, and I witnessed this, they sniffed the hair of our young men in the tent. One skunk actually crawled in with them briefly. Now, to their credit, these boys did not panic. And I would say not every group of high school boys is going to be quite that contained. They lay there as still as they could until the skunks left. Needless to say, it could have been much, much worse. And I will tell you that these boys followed the rules the rest of the week. But here's the point I want to make with that story. Long before these kids saw their first animal, they had been given clues. The first clue was that they needed to trust us that there were, in fact, bears and skunks and other animals there. The second clue was that they actually had people in front of them who had been here before. We had actually stayed in that very same campground. We knew what kind of animals were likely to come out at night, and so they had those clues. The third clue was there were signs posted all around the campground. If you've ever camped in the Great Smoky Mountains, there's all kinds of signs warning about the danger from the animals who lived in that part of the woods. Now, here's my point. There was enough evidence for these kids to believe us and save themselves from the grief they got into, and at least for this time, they had a pretty decent outcome. Well, the consequences were not as bad as they could have been. But there was enough evidence for them to say, I really need to listen and do what these people are telling me. If I'm going to see wild animals, it's going to be at the direction of those who are guiding me. And sure enough, later that week, we had encounters with bears. We had other animals while we were hiking on the trail, but it was all at a safe distance, at no danger to to ourselves or anyone else. What am I trying to say with this? If you are stuck on the if side of this resurrection discussion, I believe there's enough evidence for you to start a journey. There's enough evidence here for you to put one foot in front of the other and see where it leads. Yes, you may have to trust somebody else who's gone down that same road before. You'll probably have to trust somebody, and eventually you'll start putting the pieces together just like some of us have. And where's it going to lead you? It's going to lead you to a flat-out miracle that confirms that Jesus of Nazareth really is the Messiah. He really is the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. He really is God. He was crucified one Friday afternoon outside of Jerusalem, and by Sunday morning he was resurrected. And that is amazing. And this is at the very core of our faith. But it's also reasonable. If you look at the evidence, it's reasonable. If that's where we are, then let's start that journey together, because there's enough evidence to at least start with the asking. But some of us are on the other side of this. We're on the, okay, Pastor, enough. I get it. You know, I come to Easter every year. Sure like being in this building better than that gymnasium we were in last year. I just thought I would throw that in there for whatever it's not worth. It's so good to see you guys. Oh, it's so good to be here on a Sunday morning, too. But Pastor, really, I believe it, but I don't know what to do with it. I mean, how does it impact me on a daily basis? Because we come once a year to talk about this, but let's look really briefly at how the resurrected Jesus steps into different lives and impacts us. Here's the first one. He steps into the doubts of our lives. He stepped into the doubts of somebody's life in this story. Some of you remember the name Thomas. We're all kind of familiar with that name because we call him Doubting Thomas. Thomas was one of the 12. He was one of those guys. He's one of the disciples, but he missed out on the first time that Jesus showed up. It appeared when it's kind of like, have you ever been the only person in a group that's not seen the movie? You know, people go, oh, have you seen the movie? It was so good. And I'm like, no, I didn't get to see it. Oh, you missed it. You know, they make you feel really bad because you haven't been to see the movie yet. It was kind of like that for Thomas. He was the only one in the room who hadn't seen Jesus yet. And everybody's going, man, you really missed it. But Thomas was at least willing to voice his doubts. In John chapter 20, verse 25, you may remember what Thomas says. He says, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were and put my hand into his side, Thomas said, I'm not going to believe it. I'm not going to believe it. So what happens? A week later, Jesus appears to them again, and he shows Thomas what Thomas needs to see. Now, Thomas has always taken a lot of heat for being the doubter. But I want you to understand at this moment, Thomas is the confessor. Because he lays out something that we really don't see much of in the New Testament. He says in John 20, verse 28, he says, my Lord and my God. And you need to understand what a big statement that was. That was outrageous for a Jewish man to refer to another man as God. That was considered blasphemy. That's one of the reasons why they crucified Jesus, because he did equate himself with God. But things are starting to fall in place for Thomas. Somehow Jesus is who he claims to be. So how did Thomas get to that place? Well, it's because Jesus stepped into his doubts. Will God do that for you? Absolutely. Is he going to show up in some physical, literal form and say, hey, you, I'm for real? No, he's not going to do that. We even see as the New Testament moves forward that Jesus stops appearing as he did to them. And by the way, Jesus did make a statement in John 20, verse 29. He said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. So what Jesus is saying is, I'm going to leave just enough evidence so that you can trust me. And blessed are the people who will check that out. Blessed are the people who will do that. But here's the second thing that happens. Jesus also enters into our failures. Jesus entered into somebody's failure big time. A lot of you remember a guy in the Bible by the name of Peter. Peter had the reputation for being the big, loudmouth screw-up of the disciples. Okay, that's who he was. The night Jesus is betrayed, they're all gathered having this intimate meal, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and Jesus begins to tell them some of the things that are going to happen. And Peter kind of jumps up and says, well, I'm not doing that. Not me. In John 13:38, Jesus says, listen, bud, by the time the rooster crows in the morning, you will have denied me 3 times. Oh, no, I won't. Oh, yes, you will. Oh, no, I won't. Oh, yes, you will. And sure enough, he does. Now, when Jesus is arrested, and if you've never read this part of the story, you really owe it to yourself to do that. Peter follows at a distance, and he sees all this stuff happening. He's in the outer courtyard of the high priest's home, and there's a mockery of a trial that's going on. And amidst all of the swearing and all of the violence that's being hurled at Jesus, Peter, in fact, denies Jesus 3 times. I don't know this guy. Never met him. What I want you to read sometime is Luke chapter 22, verses 61 and 62. Because in that moment, what it tells us, in the midst of all this, Jesus turns and makes eye contact with Peter. Peter knows. Peter knows that Jesus knows. And he runs into the darkness, and it tells us he weeps bitterly. This time he's done it. That might be the end of it, but it isn't. Because the resurrected Lord now steps into Peter's failures. A little bit later, around a cook fire. And then walking along a shoreline, Jesus forgives his friends. And he restores Peter, and he gives Peter the do-over of a lifetime. And it changes him forever. What does that mean for us? Well, it means if you're sitting here today and you're going, well, listen, Pastor, it wouldn't work for me because you don't have a clue what I've been involved in. Nobody knows how dark and ugly my sin is. The person I'm sitting next to has no idea. And my parents would die if they knew what I was doing. And the people at work, My spouse? Are you kidding me? My life is so messed up, I'm damaged goods. What could Easter possibly mean to me? Well, I'll tell you what Easter means to you. It means that God will step into your failure, he will forgive you, and he will restore you. I'm not saying there aren't going to be consequences. I'm just saying God redeems messes and he heals those broken situations. That's what Easter could mean to you. And if you don't hear anything else that I say today, you need to know this. God is still in the business of forgiving broken people. He loves to forgive broken people, of which I am one, and so are you. But it's not just that he steps into our failures. God also steps into the disasters. He steps into our disasters that we didn't ask for. We didn't do anything for some of the stuff we've gone through, right? You've had stuff happen to you that really wasn't your fault. It was because of somebody else. I'm going to tell you part of the story here that nobody talks about. And I've never heard anybody else preach about this on Easter. I want to be careful what I say. Nobody talks about the mother of Jesus at the resurrection. There's good reason for that. It's because we don't have any evidence of how she reacted to this stuff. So I have to be really careful with what I tell you. But let me start with this. Mary knew who Jesus was. Before anybody else, God had clued her in. So you think about that. You think about throughout the years of her life, what was it like for Mary to watch her boy grow up? Asking questions. What is God going to do? How is this all going to go? What do you think it was like for Mary when Jesus started putting himself in places of danger? What do you think it was like for her when she hears all of the insults and the accusations and all of the junk that was being hurled at him? How much do you think her heart died when she caught her first glimpse of her mangled, abused son hanging on the cross? She was there. Scripture tells us that. John 19, verse 25 says, by the cross stood Mary, his mother. She saw him die. She knows he's dead. She knows he's been taken down and put in a tomb. How does all of that compute in her brain? Think back to what happened at the beginning of the story. She had a vision. She had an angel given to her. She had shepherds who came and told her good news. The wise men came later. She knows. And now, what she knows is that Jesus is dead. And Jesus is buried. God, what is going on here? This is a disaster. What do you think it was like when Mary saw her son resurrected? Ever think about that? Ever have that thought go through your mind? We got to be careful here because we don't know what was said. It's not recorded in Scripture. But we do know that Mary was around because when you look in the book of Acts, which is the history of the early church, you find her hanging out with the disciples. It tells us she was praying with them in Acts chapter 1, verse 14. And this is after Jesus has returned to heaven, so we know that she is a part of this movement. She was there when Jesus resurrected. What did she say? I was hoping that this was the way it would turn out? Or was she as shocked as everybody else? We don't know. What we do know is that in the coming days, the followers of Jesus, they share this story, and they start looking back on some of the things that Jesus had said. And it starts to make sense to them. Things like John chapter 16, where he says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. Now they get it. This is what he meant by overcoming the world. He really did break death's hold. My point to you is that Jesus can step into your disaster and he can have the last word. How can I say that? Because I've seen it happen in my own life. I was a youth pastor at another church in another state. It was not a good place for us to be. The church was struggling internally. We as a family were struggling financially. Our daughter was only a few months old. And then one day my wife suffers a serious neck injury. The likes of which, well, to try and describe it, it would just be better to say she broke her neck. We went from doctor to doctor. We went from clinic to clinic, but help and relief was very slow in coming. At that point, we're young. We don't know a whole lot. It seemed like the weight of the world was on our shoulders. We thought at times that we were in the middle of a disaster. And we just kept looking for God to lead us. We just kept praying for God to lead us. And I promise you, as God is my witness, in the middle of all that chaos, there was a faint glimmer of hope that found its way into our disaster. It did not make things go away. There are some things that Alita still has to deal with because of that injury so many years ago. But I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but that little glimmer of hope kept us on the path. And God helped us, and God directed us. And that's what put us on the path to where we are today. What am I trying to say? God's not thrown by your disaster. He's been there, and he's come through it. If you've got a marriage and you're not even sure you can invest in it anymore, if there's an addiction that is breaking your back, if there's a challenge at work that you don't have the answers for, if there's a financial situation threatening to pull the rug out from under you, don't give up. Not while God is still at work. And if you write down anything today, I want you to write down what's going to be on the screen next. God does some of his best work in graveyards. You got to hang that on the refrigerator or put that on the bathroom mirror or put it in the car so that you can see it. You are not going to cause that wreck. You're not going to be, okay, don't you understand? But God does some of his best work in the most difficult situations. How can I say that? Think about this question. How did the cross become such an amazing, powerful, beautiful symbol for us? You know what it meant back then? The cross meant death. The cross stood for execution. It's grotesque. It's gruesome. How did the cross become this source of comfort for us? How did that happen? Why was the cross such a big deal? Answer, because of the resurrection. Think about that. Without the resurrection, the cross is just a really, really bad day. But with it, it's everything. It's why for over 2,000 years, people have reminded themselves of this amazing love, of this amazing grace, of this amazing story. And what I'm asking you to do is to investigate it for yourself. And once you reach that point that you can accept it, I'm asking you to do something about it. And I realize some of you may be at that point this morning. Some of you aren't there yet. And we're okay with that. Because it's going to take time for you to understand or believe some of these things. But some of you believe it now. So I'm going to ask all of us to stand right now, if we would. And I'm going to invite all of us to pray out loud with me so you can start a relationship with Jesus. No pressure. Nobody twisting arms. Not going to sing 57 verses of Just As I Am or Kumbaya. Okay? Nothing like that. But I want us to all pray this prayer out loud. All I ask is when we pray it, that you mean it with all your heart. The Bible says if we confess that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts that he rose from the dead, we will be saved. Let's bow our heads, close our eyes if it helps. Repeat these words after me. Dear Jesus, come into my heart. Forgive me of my sin. Help me to live for you and to love you all the days of my life. Today I'm new. Today I'm changed. Today I'm forgiven. And today I'm free. In Jesus' mighty name, amen. Thank you for being here today. If you prayed that prayer and you need to talk to somebody, come up and see me afterwards. Talk to Teresa. We would love to be able to walk you through this investigation. And now, if you would, join us in a final song, and then you're dismissed.